The reach of the shuttle, triumph or tragedy. The space race, or the competition between the US and the Soviet Union to develop aerospace technology, including man-made satellites, remotely controlled space probes, and human space travel, began with the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik 1 in 1957. Consequently, on July 29, 1958, President Eisenhower signed the statute that created NASA. Project Mercury, United States' first man-in-space program, aiming to put a man into Earth's orbit ideally before the Soviet Union, made Alan Shepard the first American in space in 1961 and John Glenn the first American to orbit Earth in 1962. The Gemini program helped NASA get ready for the Apollo moon landings by achieving know-how on the effects of extended stay in space on the astronauts, taught astronauts to spacewalk, and how to connect two spacecraft in orbit. Project Apollo is credited with far-reaching human spaceflight milestones. It is the only program that has sent manned missions beyond low Earth orbit. The Apollo program enabled us to achieve the unimaginable, land on the moon, explore its surface, and leave behind scientific instruments that continue to send data back to Earth years after the last astronaut left the moon. With Apollo, US fulfilled President Kennedy's challenge of landing a man on moon and bringing him safely back to Earth, and established its lead in the space race.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This was the golden era of American space exploration. We triumphed against all odds to boldly go where no man had gone before. NASA had the drive to take us to the moon and back. On the 5th of January 1972, based on the decision made by President Richard M. Nixon and NASA Administrator Dr. James C. Fletcher, NASA moved away from the successful long-range capsule-based missions and started focusing on the short-ranged, eventually expensive shuttle missions, which took up 90% of the NASA manned spaceflight budget, putting all their eggs in one basket and leaving no room for any other manned mission. In an interview with the Apollo 11 crew, Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin were asked if they were surprised that US hadn't gone back to the moon.
I'd prefer to see us go to Mars rather than go back to the moon, unless we need the moon as a stepping stone to Mars.
And I think it's going to be inconceivable when future historians look back and see that what a tremendous capability was put together by one nation, and then it was sort of set aside and laid to rest.
Tragically, NASA currently does not have manned space mission capability, and other countries, some that had no space presence at all, have made tremendous technological advancements and have overtaken the US in the space race. The switch to the reusable space shuttle was due to a multitude of reasons. The expensive Apollo flights required a new capsule after every launch. Even during the Apollo missions, NASA's budget was being questioned and reduced by the government, and the 1966 budget started a decline that continued every year for the next decade. A 1969 Harris poll reported that 56% of Americans believed that costs of the Apollo program were too great. In 1970, President Richard Nixon indicated that the mood of the country demanded major cuts in the space program. This resulted in the cancellation of the last two Apollo flights, marking the tragic end of the Apollo program and the move to the low-cost and economical space transportation shuttle program. President Nixon believed in the potential and use of satellites for international communications, global monitoring, and managing natural resources. The US started the Space Shuttle program, which, although saw a few triumphs, has been fraught with multiple tragedies. The shuttle construction was delayed, resulting in the disintegration of the Skylab space station in 1979. Every shuttle was supposed to fly 50 missions a year, but averaged only about 4. The total number of trips made by all 5 shuttles was 135, or 27 per shuttle, which was nowhere close to the 100 trips a shuttle as proposed. The shuttles were only designed for 10 years each, but were kept in use for almost thrice the time, preventing technological advancement and innovation at NASA. They were designed to carry large space station parts, which committed us to build an expensive low-orbit space station. Tragically, the result was a human spaceflight program stuck in low Earth orbit since the end of 1972. The shuttles were designed to be used like a bus to the ISS, traveling a short distance of about 350 miles, while the Apollo missions were racing 238,000 miles to the moon and back. The shuttle program was eventually expensive. The total cost of the shuttle project was close to $192 billion, and given that we made a total of 135 flights, NASA spent an average of almost $1.5 billion per flight. Apart from these shortcomings of the Space Shuttle program, there is yet another that labels the Space Shuttle as the deadliest space program. The Mercury and Gemini missions had no fatalities, and although having had an initial setback with Apollo 1, the Apollo program improved on safety, so much so that the Apollo 13 crew reached home safely despite a problem. In comparison, the explosions of the Challenger and Columbia shuttles have together resulted in 14 fatalities. The Columbia tragedy occurred because NASA decided to continue with the Columbia return flight, although a piece of insulation had punched a hole in the left wing during takeoff. The shuttle managers believed foam strikes were harmless, so they left the future disaster be. The shuttle program was preferred by the US government because it was perceived to be a low-cost, simple pickup truck which was good enough under the presumption of no formidable competition, which was not true. For example, China, the rookie in the space race, sent its first man to space just 16 years ago in 2003. It became the third country to soft land a spacecraft on the moon in 2013, the first to land on the far side of the moon in 2019, and is currently planning a manned lunar mission in the next decade. Presently, Russia and China are the only 2 nations that have manned space mission capability, and NASA astronauts have to rely on the Russian Soyuz for space travel. The tragedy is that the US government let the hare sleep, allowing the tortoise to advance. Admirers may argue in favor of the many achievements of the shuttle, such as launching various satellites and space probes into space, its use by astronauts for experiments on life in weightlessness, and, above all, carrying large parts into space to build the International Space Station. Although the achievements of the shuttle program are numerous, the price paid by the US was too high, and the failures of the shuttle could easily eclipse the program's achievements. In the near future, NASA plans to go to Mars and deeper into space using the Orion spacecraft, which is similar to NASA's Apollo capsule. Orion will use modern technology in many other areas such as computers, electronics, life support systems, and propulsion systems, showing that NASA is investing in technological advancement and innovation, which will help to overcome the tragedies and position NASA towards further triumphs. In retrospect, the historical space exploration lead gained by the US was tragically foregone with the loss of manned space mission capability.